My name is Julia Von Essen, and I'll be discussing a study on the relationship between listener attitudes toward non-native talkers and their accents, and the comprehension of non-native accented speech. We all know native speakers of a language often find it difficult to understand non-native accented speech. This is captured by a construct called intelligibility, which is defined as the extent to which a listener comprehends a speaker's message. In interactions between native and non-native speakers, the burden of ensuring comprehension has traditionally fallen on the non-native speaker. There's an underlying expectation for them to increase their intelligibility by somehow improving their proficiency. However, this view is challenged by multiple studies demonstrating the contribution of listener factors to the comprehension of non-native accented speech, including factors such as the listener's native language, brief exposure to non-native accented speech, and wider experience with non-native accented speech. Hayes-Harb et al. 2008 found that native Mandarin listeners were more accurate than native English listeners at identifying Mandarin accented English words, suggesting that a listener's native language background is related to their ability to comprehend non-native accented speech. Clark and Garrett 2004 found that listeners' processing speeds for non-native accented speech were initially slower than for native accented speech, but that this difference disappeared with less than a minute of exposure, demonstrating the ability of listeners to quickly adapt to non-native accented speech. Lastly, Kennedy and Trofimovich 2008 found that listeners with experience listening to non-native accented speech transcribed sentences produced by non-native talkers more accurately than inexperienced listeners did. In addition to these factors, another factor that is of interest is listener attitudes towards a particular talker or accent, especially since negative attitudes toward non-native speakers are so widespread. Indeed, Ingvelson et al. 2017 investigated the existence of a relationship between listener attitudes toward specific non-native talkers and the intelligibility of those talkers' speech. They had listeners rate non-native accented talkers and their speech on several different characteristics and transcribe phrases produced by those talkers. They also assessed listeners' cognitive performance and hearing acuity. They found that listener attitudes accounted for a small but significant percentage of the variance in transcription accuracy, even after listener age, hearing acuity, and cognitive performance were accounted for. However, they only had one talker for each of 5 native languages, thus conflating talker and native language. In the present study, we follow up on Ingvelson et al.'s work by including 8 talkers for each of 3 native languages, in order to be able to make a distinction between the talker and the talker's native language. However, we use different materials than Ingvelson et al., allowing us to test the robustness of the effect that they found. The research question that we are investigating is whether there is a relationship between listeners' attitudes towards non-native talkers and their speech, and how well they comprehend speech produced by those talkers. We're also interested in whether that relationship is affected by the native language of the talker, the listener's bilingual status, whether or not the listener speaks any second languages, and the listener's gender. For the speech materials, we selected 24 talkers from an existing speech database at the University of Utah. They were ages 20 to 43 with a mean age of 26.4, and there were 8 talkers each for Korean, Mandarin, and Spanish. 16 were female and 8 were male. 19 talkers reported having lived in an English-speaking country with length of stay ranging from 2 months to 23 years, and a mean length of stay of 5.6 years. No attempt was made to control for the proficiency levels of the talkers. Throughout this presentation, we will use talker to refer specifically to those 24 participants who produced the recordings used in the experiment. One production of the Please Call Stella passage was used for each talker. As an example, here's a brief excerpt from the passage.
Please call Stella, ask her to bring these things with her from the store.
We also used 240 recordings of BKB sentences, 10 from each talker. Here is an example recording.
The children are working home.
This is a histogram showing the distribution of proportion of the keywords correctly transcribed of the BKB sentences from pilot data collected from 109 native English participants. As you can see, there was a ceiling effect on proportion keywords correct. In order to make the task more difficult, we embedded the BKB sentences in 6-talker babble with a signal-to-noise ratio of 0. Here's an example of what that sounded like.
The children are working home.
In addition to the talkers, we also had 60 listeners, native English speakers recruited from University of Utah linguistics courses. They were ages 18 to 62 with a mean age of 23.1, and they received course credit for participation. 31 of the listeners were female and 29 were male. In addition, 5 identified a native language in addition to English, what we will refer to as bilingual, and 44 identified experience with at least one L2. We excluded an additional 16 participants for having childhood experience with one or more of the target languages. In addition, a listener's responses to a particular talker were excluded if the listener had L2 experience with that talker's L1. We excluded 1 listener for Korean, 5 for Mandarin, and 25 for Spanish. The survey was conducted online through Qualtrics. Participants were asked to use headphones and complete the study in a quiet environment. To ensure that those conditions were at least partly met, participants first performed a sound check where they had to identify 4 English words at 100% accuracy. Once they passed the sound check, the participants were consented. They completed 2 tasks, an attitude rating task and a transcription task. For both tasks, each listener was randomly assigned to 12 talkers, 4 per language. For the attitude rating task, listeners heard the Please Call Stella passage from each of their 12 talkers in random order. They rated both the speech and the talker on 10 different characteristics on a 5-point Likert scale. This was following the procedure of Ingvelson et al. And adapted from Pantos and Perkins 2013. The speech characteristics were pleasantness, romantic qualities, warmth, refinement, and ease of understanding. They are rated from least/lowest to most/highest, where a rating of least corresponded to a numerical value of 5, and a rating of most corresponded to a numerical value of 1. The ratings for these 5 speech characteristics were averaged to produce a speech attitude score. A lower score corresponded to a more positive rating. The talker characteristics, education, class status, pleasantness, friendliness, and confidence, were similarly rated. The ratings for the 5 talker characteristics were averaged to produce a talker attitude score. Again, a lower score corresponded to a more positive rating. For the transcription task, listeners were randomly assigned to one of 2 sentence orderings. They transcribed 60 sentences, 5 from each talker. The sentences were blocked by talker and presented in random order. The transcriptions were coded for the proportion of keywords correctly transcribed. Here's another histogram showing the distribution of scores of proportion keywords correct, which represents intelligibility. If you compare it to the histogram from the pilot data, you can see that embedding the sound files in 6-talker Babel resulted in a normal distribution. This is a scatter plot showing speech attitude scores on the vertical axis and talker attitude scores on the horizontal axis. I want to draw your attention to the fact that for both of these scores, a lower score corresponds to a more positive rating, as demonstrated by the red and green arrows. Like Ingvelson et al., we found that these 2 measures were highly correlated, and therefore we also collapsed them into a single composite attitude score. We use this composite attitude score for all further analyses. And now for general results. Here's a scatter plot, oriented differently than the previous one, with composite attitude on the vertical axis and proportion keywords correct, which relates to intelligibility, on the horizontal axis. Again, a more positive attitude score is lower, while a higher proportion keywords correct corresponds to a greater intelligibility. If we see a relationship between attitudes and intelligibility, we would expect to see a negative correlation here. Indeed, a hierarchical linear regression showed that attitude accounted for 3.7% of the variance in proportion keywords correct, after listener age, listener L2s, listener bilingual status, and listener gender were accounted for. This suggests that, yes, there is a relationship between listener attitudes and intelligibility, and that it goes in the direction we'd expect, with more positive attitudes corresponding to increased intelligibility. Moving on to discuss talker language. Here are some general patterns in the data. On the left is a box plot showing composite attitude scores for Korean, Mandarin, and Spanish. On the right is a box plot showing proportion keywords correct, again for Spanish, Korean, and Mandarin. You can see from the plots that Spanish was rated significantly more positively than the other 2 languages, and that Mandarin was significantly less intelligible than the other 2 languages. But remember, no attempt was made to control for proficiency of the talkers. This is the same scatter plot as before, with attitude on the vertical axis and intelligibility on the horizontal axis, split by talker language. In blue you have Korean, in red Mandarin, and in green Spanish. We performed a hierarchical linear regression separately for each talker language. These regressions showed that, for Korean, attitude did not account for an additional significant % of the variance in intelligibility after all other variables were accounted for. For Mandarin, however, attitude accounted for an additional 1.8% of the variance, while for Spanish, it was 14.8%, a noteworthy increase. That suggests that yes, the native language of the talker affects the relationship between listener attitudes and intelligibility. But again, no attempt was made to control for proficiency. The next factor we looked at was the listener's bilingual status. Here are the same box plots as before, split between monolingual and bilingual listeners, with a plot showing attitude on the left and a plot showing intelligibility on the right. We did not test whether these distributions were significantly different due to the fact that there were only 5 bilingual listeners. Looking at the same scatterplot of attitude and intelligibility split by the listener's bilingual status, we see monolingual listeners in blue and bilingual listeners in red. Again, we performed a hierarchical linear regression separately for monolingual and bilingual listeners, looking for variance in intelligibility after all other variables were accounted for. For monolinguals, attitude accounted for an additional 3.5% of the variance, while for bilingual listeners, attitude did not contribute significantly to the variance. But again, there were only 5 bilingual listeners. Because of the small number of bilinguals, we were unable to draw a conclusion on whether bilingual status of the listener affects the relationship between listener attitudes and intelligibility. Moving on to listeners with and without second languages. Here are the same 2 box plots showing the attitudes for listeners without L2s and with L2s, and intelligibility for listeners without L2s and with L2s. Listeners with L2s rated the talkers significantly more positively than listeners without L2s, but intelligibility didn't differ between the 2 groups. If we look at the scatterplot of attitude and intelligibility for listeners with and without L2s, we see listeners without L2s in blue and listeners with L2s in red. Again, we performed a hierarchical linear regression separately for listeners with and without L2s, looking for variance in intelligibility after all other variables were accounted for. For listeners without L2s, attitude did not contribute significantly to the variance in intelligibility, while for listeners with L2s, attitude accounted for an additional 4.2% of the variance. That suggests that yes, whether the listener has any L2s has an effect on the relationship between listener attitudes and intelligibility. Lastly, we looked at listener gender. Here are box plots showing the attitudes for female listeners and male listeners, and intelligibility for female listeners and male listeners. Female listeners rated the talkers significantly more positively than male listeners, but intelligibility didn't differ significantly between the 2 groups. If we look at the scatterplot for attitude and intelligibility, we can see females in blue and males in red. Again, we performed a hierarchical linear regression for female and male listeners separately, looking for variance in proportion keywords correct after all variables other than listener gender were accounted for. For females, attitude accounted for an additional 1.7% of the variance, while for males, attitude accounted for an additional 7.8% of the variance. That difference suggests that yes, listener gender has an impact on the relationship between attitude and intelligibility. In summary, our study provided evidence that more positive attitudes towards non-native talkers and their speech are associated with increased intelligibility of speech produced by those talkers. In addition, the results suggested that the strength of that relationship differs by native language, and that the strength of the relationship appears to increase for male listeners and listeners with experience with second languages. Due to low sample size, we were unable to draw any conclusion about the listener's bilingual status. Data collection for an additional experiment with the same method, except that listeners are assigned to different talkers for the attitude task than for the intelligibility task, is complete. The fact that the same talkers will no longer be in both tasks will allow us to attempt to tease apart talker and talker native language. In addition, we have planned a fuller replication of Ingelsson et al. 2017, which will include measures of listener cognitive performance and hearing acuity, although in-person data collection has been postponed. There were 2 intriguing findings that merit further discussion. The results suggest that the relationship between attitude and intelligibility may be stronger for males than for females. While initially surprising, this finding fits with studies that have shown that males and females respond differently to the same language stimuli in various settings. In addition, attitude accounted for much more variance in transcription accuracy for Spanish than for the other languages. Given the status of Spanish in the US and the fact that there are so many more Spanish speakers relative to other languages, this is a finding that is worth following up on. Our study provided further evidence that the listener contributes to intelligibility, supporting the idea that intelligibility is the responsibility of both the speaker and the listener. This is actually good news because it suggests that there are multiple paths to enhancing the intelligibility of non-native accented speech from both sides of the interaction. Thank you.